Yo, what's going on, U.S. History people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lawrence.
And we have part 2 for you of the U.S. Regents review. This one is going from the 1850s until the 1920s. All right, so let's start talking about the Fugitive Slave Law. This was part of the Compromise of 1850. This was an incredibly tough fugitive slave law that required Northerners to actively participate in the return of runaway slaves. And this made many join the abolitionist movement in the North. Sorry for blocking movement, but it made many people in the North jump on the abolitionist bandwagon.
You need to move that sign.
Oh, I see what you did there. That was good.
All right, so how did people join this movement? Well, a lot of people came to the abolitionist movement through writings, and specifically two writings we have here is The Liberator and also Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, Mr. Norris, tell us, who wrote The Liberator?
Liberator was William Lloyd Garrison, and he wrote this weekly newspaper every single week from 1831 to 1865, just talking about how bad slavery is. And look at that word liberate, that means to free. So if you're trying to figure out what it is, liberator means free.
Uncle Tom's Cabin, probably one of the most important books that you know from this course, up there with The Jungle up in Sinclair. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a lady, her name was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who really went to the South, saw what was happening in regards to slavery, published a book, and this kind of becomes the rallying cry for many abolitionists of really how difficult the lives of slaves were in the South. I think there were almost as many copies sold as the Bible, or maybe the Bible only outsold Uncle Tom's Cabin when it was published, so very popular reading at the time.
Absolutely, it was huge. So those two, Liberator and Uncle Tom's Cabin, are often linked together in multiple choice questions, so be familiar with them. So some other abolitionists you should know. Again, we're going to put this up here twice because it's important. The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, the former slave who ran away and created a newspaper called the North Star, and he was a staunch abolitionist, as was Harriet Beecher Stowe, which Mr. Lawrence just talked about. Harriet Tubman, you know her from the Underground Railroad and helped slaves escape from the South to the North. And then finally, John Brown and his raid at Harper's Ferry. He tried to end slavery by creating a rebellion, which was not successful.
So as we see in many reform movements across the United States, reformers tend to kind of take their action into politics, and they organize themselves into a free soil party, and these were abolitionists who were against the spread of slavery into Western territory. So as Manifest Destiny continues to be an issue in the United States, the concern about slavery moving west will dominate the discussion in American politics.
Absolutely. So let's go over to the KansasNebraska Act. This is in 1854. We have Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois. He proposed popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. Mr. Lawrence, what is popular sovereignty?
That's the idea that people have the right to vote specifically on an issue, yes or no.
Now, if we were to look at a map, we would notice that both Kansas and Nebraska are above that 36-30 Missouri Compromise line. Now, according to the Missouri Compromise, they both should have been free states, but the South was not on board with that, so the KansasNebraska Act overturns the Missouri Compromise.
All right, so the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, probably, again, one of the top cases you need to know coming into your exam this June. What was this case about? Well, it says Supreme Court declared African Americans that were not citizens. So Mr. Sanford versus Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who was suing for his freedom because he was moved to a free territory. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against him, saying that slaves were really seen as property, not as individuals guaranteed constitutional rights. So slavery would be considered constitutional. This was a big win for people who were supporting slavery and westward expansion. Congress had no right to legislate the issue of slavery, and Northerners were upset. Specifically, the Democratic Party splits along sectional lines over the issue of slavery. So again, Dred Scott, very important in the road to war in the United States.
So 2 years later at Harper's Ferry, Virginia at the time, now in West Virginia, we have the raid by John Brown. This was a planned uprising in which he took over an armory, or a government building that has weapons, and he envisioned giving rifles and different weapons to slaves to cause a massive rebellion. This does not occur. He's actually captured about 12 hours into it, and he is later hanged. And many Southerners believe that there would be more John Browns from the North coming down to try to eliminate slavery.
And Mr. Norris, this was a significant fear in the South of the fear of slave revolts and uprisings by many Southerners, right?
Huge fear. Huge fear.
So when Harper's Ferry happens, again, it's a very strong pushback by Southerners, concerned that Northerners are going to kind of come down and promote these slave uprisings. All right, so the election of 1860, extremely significant event on our lead up to the Civil War. This is when Abraham Lincoln is elected. He is the first Republican president. The party actually starts around the issue of slavery. And really, this is seen as the immediate cause of civil war. Lincoln campaigned on the non-extension of slavery, not to eliminate slavery. So he specifically said he was not going to eliminate slavery if he was elected president. He just wanted it to stop and stay where it was. But to the South, this was just as bad, and eventually we will see the road to secession, with South Carolina being the first state to pull away from the Union.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're writing an essay about Lincoln or the causes of the Civil War, please do not write that he ran on a platform of eliminating slavery. That is not true. He basically said slavery will live with slavery where it is, but it cannot expand. So let's jump ahead to the war. We have border states, and these were slave states that did not secede during the war. States like Kentucky and Maryland that owned slaves but fought on behalf of the Union.
So habeas corpus, something that is guaranteed to us, or a kind of a theory within the Constitution. And what this was, it states that people cannot be held in jail without having charges brought against you. During the Civil War, Lincoln actually suspended this, and it was very controversial because he saw this as a time of rebellion, that he needed extraordinary powers as the president. But really, only Congress can suspend this. So this was, again, Lincoln had the power, kind of gave himself the power to prevent people from going to trial in a rapid manner.
So that's a perfect example of something we've talked about in class throughout the year, and we'll continue to talk about, that during times of war, your rights go down. Please, right now, right next to habeas corpus, write down, rights go down during times of war. Rights go down during times of war. Rights go down during times of war. All right, let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. It's important to know what it did and what it did not do. It did not free all slaves. Rather, it only freed slaves in areas of rebellion in the South. And this changed the purpose of the war from preserving the Union, as Lincoln said was the reason why he was fighting the Civil War, to ending slavery. So in 1863, when this goes into effect on January 1st, the transition begins to make this a war about ending slavery.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the war eventually comes to an end. For the purposes of this course, we don't spend a lot of time on the actual conflict itself. Something that does come up sometimes, though, is this phrase that was referred to as the Anaconda Plan. It was the idea that the North actually would surround the South and really kind of just squeeze the South like an anaconda in order to try and bring an end to the war. So just something, if you see that in your exam, keep that in mind, dealing with the North versus the South. All right, so the war is over. The North wins, the South loses. So the next question is, what is the United States going to look like after the worst conflict that the country has ever seen? So Reconstruction. So what is Reconstruction? Well, this is the rebuilding of the nation after the Civil War.
So there are two different plans for Reconstruction. This is really a power struggle between the executive and legislative branches. The presidential Reconstruction plans, whether it is Lincoln or Johnson, tended to be much more lenient or favorable to the South. They only required 10% of people who voted in the election of 1860 to pledge loyalty to the nation, and they had to adopt the 13th Amendment, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction was much more harsh. They divided the South into 5 different zones, and each one was ruled by a military general from the North.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the 13th Amendment, extremely important. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Mr. Norris, what do we call these amendments?
Reconstruction Amendments.
We call them the Reconstruction Amendments. So the 13th Amendment will make slavery illegal.
So this will essentially overturn, in part, the Dred Scott decision and get rid of that 3/5 compromise from the Constitution.
So what you're saying, Mr. Norris, is the Emancipation Proclamation, that really didn't carry on after the Civil War?
Very good point. It did not. No. So in order to make slavery illegal permanently, they had to create an amendment.
Interesting.
Now, the 14th Amendment does 2 things. It granted citizenship to blacks and all people born in the United States, and it also provided for equal protection for citizens. That second part is something you'll be focusing on a lot more next year in government.
All right, and finally, the 15th Amendment granted suffrage for really African-American men within the South. So the South did find loopholes, as we've studied, things like the Jim Crow laws. Examples were poll taxes, literacy tests, that really prevented African-Americans from having the opportunity to truly exercise the right to vote.
Is there a way we remember the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments?
I think so. It's free citizens vote.
I feel like we should have them write that down right now.
I think it's a great idea.
So please write down Free Citizens Vote right now.
And then write it one more time.
Oh, yeah. Write down twice. Scalawags were Southerners that favored Reconstruction during this time. And then carpetbaggers, we see a picture of a carpetbagger right here. They were Northerners that moved to the South during Reconstruction. And they were terrorized and disliked by the KKK and other organizations that were trying to prevent Reconstruction from happening.
All right, so let's talk impeachment. Unfortunately for Abraham Lincoln, we know he is assassinated right at the end of the war by a guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth. As a result of his assassination, his vice president Andrew Johnson steps in, and he does not really fare so well politically. Now, what's unique about Andrew Johnson, Mr. Norris, at the time?
He was a Democrat from the South.
All right, so Democrat from the South leading the North. This is kind of an issue, and he's going to run into a lot of problems with Congress. He was disliked by radical Republicans, people who wanted to punish the South for starting the Civil War. So eventually he will be impeached. So does that mean he's kicked out of office?
No, it means that charges are brought against him.
That's right. So for violating the Tenure of Office Act, I know we've talked a lot about that. It's really, I'm just kidding. We really don't talk about the Tenure of Office Act. The big thing you need to know, though, is he was impeached but not removed from office. It was a very close vote, but he stayed in as president.
He got impeached for firing this dude. Do you think it was because of his beard he fired him?
Who is that dude?
That's Stanton with his
right.
sweet beard, Secretary of War. All right, so let's jump ahead to the end of Reconstruction. What ended it? And it is the Compromise of 1877. And holy cow, is this very important to know. It's so important to know it is covered up right now. So this settles the dispute of the presidential election of 1876. So Hayes is a Republican running for president, and he's running against Samuel Tilden, a Democrat. Now, there is essentially disputes over electoral votes. So a committee is formed, and Hayes becomes president. And the important thing to know, holy cow, please circle this right now. The Compromise of 1877 ends Reconstruction. The military is withdrawn from the South. And also a Southerner is appointed to the cabinet of Hayes. So this is a way for Republicans to still be in control of the presidency, but they have to promise to end Reconstruction in the South.
And this ultimately allows Jim Crow to be established for generations in the South.
Absolutely. This is also known as the Great Betrayal sometimes.
All right, so this leads us into the Gilded Age. This is when we started talking about industrialization and urbanization. So what is the Gilded Age if you see this term? Well, it was a term coined by a guy by the name of Mark Twain, a very famous author at the time. Although things look great on the surface for Americans, there were many societal issues that were happening. There was a huge gap between the extremely rich and the working class and the poor.
So we have some talking about business during the Gilded Age. We have the growth of monopolies, things like Carnegie Steel, Rockefeller Oil, Vanderbilt, and his railroad. So we see businesses gain a lot of power. And one way the rich justified their wealth, people like Carnegie and Rockefeller, was through social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest, the belief that rich people deserve to be rich. And if you were poor, you just need to work a little harder.
All right, so then eventually we had the election of Ulysses S. Grant, poor useless S. Grant, his brother used to call him. We watched that video. But
he stood on a horse on his hands.
Yeah, he was still a pretty good military leader. He helped the North beat the South. So eventually he is elected, and he was seen as kind of not your average politician. But unfortunately for him, because he wasn't the average politician, maybe he wasn't really ready to be one. And as president, there were some scandals, specifically the Credit Mobilier and the Whiskey Ring scandal. So not necessarily Grant himself was involved, but a lot of his supporters and his advisors were. So he really got seen as, he had some negatives as president.
Boss Tweed, we know him, political cartoon. Many political cartoons were created about him. He was the leader of Tammany Hall, a Democratic political machine. He stole over $200 million from New York City, actually fled to Spain and was caught due to people recognizing him from Thomas Nast's political cartoons.
So an artist brings down one of the most powerful politicians of the time. All right, so at the time when we have this division between the wealthy and the working class, you start to see the growth of organized labor and unions in the United States. Some major early unions we need to know are specifically the Knights of Labor, which allowed all skilled and unskilled workers to join, so they believed in power in numbers. And then we also had the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which we still see remnants of today, which specifically only wanted skilled workers because they felt that if you are a skilled worker, you have more power over your employer and they can't fill your job so quickly if you got fired. Leader you have to know is a guy by the name of Samuel Gompers, who pushed for an 8-hour workday as well as collective bargaining, which allowed workers to push for better working conditions and pay. Immigrants were hard to unionize because of language barriers, also disliked by many native workers and liked by employers because they could pay them what?
Less money.
Less money.
All right, strikes during the Gilded Age. If you ever see a strike, chances are it occurred because of wage cuts, and the government almost always will side with owners. They will send in the military to end the strike. So we have the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Homestead Strike of 1892, and the Pullman Strike of 1894. The Haymarket Square Riot of 1886 turned violent, and this led to the demise of the Knights of Labor. And we see the AFL really becomes the main union in this country.
All right, so a major piece of legislation passed by Congress during the Gilded Age you need to know for your exam is the Interstate Commerce Act. Mr. Norris, what does interstate mean again?
2 or more states.
All right, so it's going across states. Intrastate would be just within a state, but inter, this gives the power of Congress to regulate the economy. So what this did, it created the ICC, which meant to regulate the railroad industry for the first time. It was also an attempt to appease farmers, to give the working class kind of a say, or having the government step in on behalf of the working class, specifically farmers. Also, was not very effective early on. This was not really seen as a effective piece of legislation at first. Over time, it becomes more powerful.
All right, let's jump on over to the West. We have Westward Expansion. Now remember, Manifest Destiny is really complete by this time, and it goes back as far as the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The government is going to help encourage westward expansion by acts like the Homestead Act, which provided 160 acres to settlers who moved out west. And also, the government played a role in the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad by giving subsidies or loans and free land and money to companies to build.
So as Manifest Destiny continues, we see Americans moving in the westward direction, but we know that land is not unpopulated. Native Americans live there, have been there for thousands of years, and have continually been pushed in that direction as well. So as settlers move west, conflicts erupt between tribes and Americans. As a result, also, we see the buffalo becomes almost extinct from hunting by settlers moving west. This greatly affects native tribes who really rely on it for hunting and gathering. The Dawes Act is passed in 1887 in an attempt to assimilate, this is a very important term, to assimilate or Americanize Native Americans. So the goal was to try and bring native tribes into the American culture, to teach them to really move away from hunter-gatherer societies to more of a farming or agricultural society. Children were sent to boarding schools. Natives were converted to Christianity. So their language, their native culture is really pushed aside in order to fill it with this Americanized culture.
So let's take a look at this picture really quick, and we'll notice on the top, or in all these pictures, how different Native Americans are dressed. They're dressed more like quote-unquote Americans or Western style. So down here on the bottom half, you notice that the men actually have shorter hair and goatees. So they were expected to change their identities and change the way they dress to become quote-unquote more American. All right, let's talk about populism in the Grange. If you see the Grange, this is a group of farmers, and they were looking to improve their social and economic opportunities. They were against railroads in particular because farmers used railroads a lot for shipment of their goods. The Populist Party becomes a popular third party during this time, and they absorbed some of the ideas from farmers and the Grange. So some of their ideas are the free and unlimited coinage of silver at a ratio of 16-1, a graduated income tax, which means the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. They wanted government ownership of the telephone and telegraph and railroads, and most importantly, these last two things. They want the initiative, referendum, and recall, and the direct election of senators. The Populist Party does not come to power, and they do not personally create these laws, but many of these are later adapted during the Progressive era.
So we do, again, as we've talked about in this course, the theme where you're seeing more democracy entering into the American system, like the referendum, like the recall, the direct election of senators, more examples of direct democracy. One also aspect of this populist party and populism of the time was the idea of free silver, of having silver back the value of the dollar in a ratio of 16-1. Now, you don't necessarily have to know the ratio, but what's important to know is that At this time, the dollar was actually backed by what precious metal?
Gold.
Gold. So today we know what's more valuable, gold or silver?
Gold.
Gold, that's true. But if it was switched to silver, that means the value of the dollar would actually decrease. There would be more money in circulation. It would help farmers and debtors pay off those debts easier. So this was something that the populists and farmers and people who joined the Grange were very supportive of, free silver.
So a dude who really kind of champions this cause is William Jennings Bryan. He is the youngest person to ever run for president at 36 years old. He won the Democratic nomination in 1896, and he was a great orator, a great speaker, and he ran against William McKinley. And he gave a famous Cross of Gold speech in which he's basically saying, hey, America, we need this introduction of silver to help out farmers.
All right, on to the progressive era. So after the populists, we have the progressives. So it's important to know the populists and progressives are two different groups. Populists tend to be seen as farmers. Progressives tend to be more urban city dwellers. So who were progressives? Well, they were women. They were members of the middle class and people that lived in urban areas, which urban is what, Mr. Norris?
City.
Cities, that's right. They wanted to find solutions to problems of society.
So a lot of these ideas do carry over from the populist era, including the direct election of senators, which is the 17th Amendment. We see the government begin to regulate railroads. We also have the introduction of the secret ballot, this idea that nobody will know who you voted for, and the income tax as well, the 16th Amendment, which allows for income tax.
All right, at this time we have the development of a phrase called muckrakers, not muckrakers, and muckrakers. And these were journalists that wanted to expose scandal, corruption, and societal ills, specifically within politics. They had mass circulation of newspapers and magazines that would expose politicians or what they saw as corrupt business leaders in order to kind of show the American people how the American system was working.
So we have Upton Sinclair, probably everybody knows him. He wrote The Jungle. This helped lead to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. All three occurred in the same year of 1906. Jacob Riis, he was a photographer who published How the Other Half Lives and exposed how poor people were living in New York City in tenements. And we have Ida Tarbell, who wrote about the harsh treatment of other businesses by Standard Oil Company. You want to know how I remember Ida Tarbell wrote about the Standard Oil Company? Tar equals oil.
That's right. All right, two other important progressives you need to know that maybe we didn't spend as much time on is Robert La Follette. And he was the governor of Wisconsin, a progressive governor who pushed for direct primaries, initiatives, referendums, and recalls. Specifically, these were all forms of state reform. And Jane Addams, the founder of the Hull House in Chicago, that helped women, immigrants, and children.
All right, so African Americans were essentially left out of government reforms during the progressive era, sadly. We do have W.E.B. Du Bois, a very influential individual that demanded immediate end to segregation, and he also helped form the NAACP. Ida B. Wells, or Ida B. Wells Barnett, she was a journalist from the South who advocated an end to lynching. Very, very influential, these two individuals.
So we see progressive amendments. So again, politicians, the government is getting very involved within this progressive period. And there are four major amendments we need to know. The first one is the 16th Amendment, which is a graduated income tax. As Mr. Norris said earlier, is the more money you make, the more money the government could tax. 17th Amendment was the direct election of senators. So no longer would you only have the right to really choose directly the House of Representatives, you can now choose for your senator as well. Also, the 18th Amendment with its prohibition, ending of the sale and consumption of illegal alcohol, and the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage.
All right, so let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt. He was president from 1901 to 1909. He had a program known as the Square Deal, which was conservation or preserving of the environment. He wanted to regulate trust, especially what he deemed as bad trust. And trust is essentially another word for monopoly. And he also advocated consumer protection. We saw that in the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act.
All right, and next we have Woodrow Wilson. He had a plan called New Freedom, and his goal was to eliminate all trusts, lower tariffs, and also create something called the Federal Reserve Act to help to regulate the American money supply. So we have Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, both considered progressive presidents, both from different parties. Roosevelt was a Republican, Wilson was a Democrat, but again, shared similar progressive ideas.
All right, let's jump on over to our last topic, U.S. imperialism through World War I. So we have the Spanish-American War. Some causes of that include yellow journalism, which is the exaggeration of stories to sell newspapers. Be able to identify Hearst and Pulitzer. There were two competing newspaper owners who tried to outsell each other. And we also have the USS Maine, which was a U.S. ship stationed in Cuba that mysteriously blew up. Nobody really knows for sure what happened, but it's almost a certainty that it was an accident. But because it was stationed in Cuba, and Spain was in control of Cuba at the time and they were the enemy, they were blamed.
And finally, we had the DeLone letter. This was written by a Spanish minister, really just saying that the United States was weak, that President McKinley was really not a great leader, and this was just one more step in that push for the United States to declare war on Spain.
And the reason it's called yellow journalism is because there was a cartoon called The Yellow Kid, and here he is, and that was the first newspaper to print in color.
So ultimately, Mr. Norris, who wins the Spanish-American War?
The U.S. wins.
So this was an overwhelming victory from the United States over a former major European imperialist power. So now the United States is starting to become or show themselves as an imperialist power on the world stage. And the question is, why would the United States want to imperialize? Well, they needed raw materials. They also wanted money for business and also more markets in order to sell goods that are being produced in the growing industrialized American economy.
Money and markets, it's all about that. All right, so let's talk about the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Let's go back really quick. Monroe Doctrine said, Europe, you stay out of Latin America, we'll stay out of European affairs. What the Roosevelt corollary does is it takes a step further, and the U.S. can now intervene in the affairs of Latin America. So we see Teddy Roosevelt here pulling this brand new steel navy, and he's carrying his big stick here, and the big stick policy was speak softly and carry a big stick. Try to work out things diplomatically, but if necessary, use the military. And the U.S. becomes a police power in Latin America. Very important to know, U.S. becomes a police power and the presence increases in Latin America.
All right, and finally, when we look at American relationships at this time with Latin America, we have the idea of dollar diplomacy. It was U.S. business investing in Latin America in order to gain access to natural resources and to markets. So the United States was concerned with economic interests in this region. So the United States will have corporations, will have different groups go into Latin America and really start to utilize, again, resources and employ people within those regions as well.
All right, so let's talk about World War I. Now, you learned last year in Global 2 the main causes of World War I. We're going to talk about the U.S. entrance, the causes for that. So we have unrestricted submarine warfare. So the causes of World War I were unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany was sinking all ships that were not German or allies of Germany. And we also have the Zimmerman Note in which Germany said to Mexico, hey, attack the United States and we'll make sure you get that land back you lost in the Mexican-American War.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we studied World War I this year. We looked at some examples of propaganda used by the government in order to mobilize people into what was called total war. That all Americans, even though if you're not fighting on the battlefront, you're still at home, you're focusing on the war, you're doing what you can in order to support the troops. So one aspect of this was really talking about how was this war going to be paid for, and it was done through income tax and the 16th Amendment, but also through Liberty bonds. So maybe you couldn't go over and fight, but you could save your money, you could buy Liberty bonds, you could support the war effort as the Americans moved forward.
All right, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson, president during World War I. At the conclusion of it, he had his idea known as the 14 Points, which creates the League of Nations, which is an international organization to try to promote peace and collective security. Now, one thing he was very big on was self-determination, this idea that countries should be able to decide for themselves their own leaders. And this was a very controversial plan, not only in the world, but especially in the U.S. And ultimately, even though the creation is because of Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. never joins the League because of George Washington's ghost. What do we mean by that, Mr. Lawrence?
Well, George Washington, when he left office, he warned us of two things: the growth and influence of political parties, but also not to get involved in foreign military alliances.
And, all right, that is it for this video. Only one more left, and we'll see you back here for that third one. Have a good day.